There is a question that is not posed in history textbooks, not because the answer is unknown, but because the answer disrupts the usual narrative. The question is simple. Why have the most powerful fortresses in Europe never engaged in full-scale battles? They did not withstand sieges, they simply never fought. They were built, maintained, and funded. Cannons, garrisons, provisions, and silence. Not a single decisive assault, not a single battle that would determine the fate of the region. Instead, there were diplomatic negotiations, surrenders without resistance, neutral statuses amidst wars. This is not a coincidence, it is a pattern. And if you examine it closely, the official narrative about military fortifications begins to crumble. Try it yourself. Take any 4 large fortresses in Central Europe that are in perfect or near-perfect condition today. Then look for information about the battles that took place within them. Most likely, you will find the same pattern. The fortress is mentioned in a historical context, but not as a place of battle. Rather, it is noted as a site for storage, imprisonment, negotiations, or ceremonies. Not as a weapon, but as a decoration of military power. A fortress that truly fought is usually in ruins. A fortress that stands today likely never engaged in battle. Let's start with a mountain in Saxony. Imagine a table mountain above the Elbe River. The height above the water is nearly 240 meters. The walls are as high as 42 meters. Not walls above the ground. These are walls that begin where the vertical cliff of the rock ends. The perimeter is almost 2 kilometers. Inside, there are more than 50 buildings. This is the fortress of Königstein. And here's what's important. In its 400 years of existence as a state fortress, it has not participated in a single battle. 0 assaults, 0 sieges that were brought to completion. Take any textbook on the military history of Saxony. Open the chapter on the 7 Years' War. Then the Napoleonic Wars. Then World War I. Then World War II. Everywhere, the fortress of Königstein is mentioned in the text. But if you try to find even one description of a real battle within or at the walls of this structure, you will find nothing. The fortress is referred to as a place of storage or place of confinement, never as a place of battle. 400 years, not a single fight. And now a question of logic. If a fortress has never been at war, what is its purpose? The official answer? For intimidation. The enemy sees the walls and hesitates to storm it. That is convincing. Until you look at what happened inside during peaceful times. Because it is precisely when there was no threat that the fortress was most active. Look at the map of the 7 Years' War. The year is 1756. The Prussian army of Frederick the Great is entering Saxony. The Saxon forces are retreating and capitulating at the foot of Königstein, right there, down below. At that moment, the fortress itself is declared neutral. Neutral. In the heat of war, when the entire country is changing masters. The official explanation is its impenetrability. Too costly to assault, too easy to withstand a siege. Sounds reasonable. But then answer one question. Why does a fortress that no one intended to attack have a well that is 152 meters deep? This well was drilled for 6 years. 6 years of continuous work to extract water for the garrison, which was theoretically supposed to withstand a prolonged siege. But there were no sieges. Not a single one. The well became the second deepest in Europe, and yet its purpose was never tested for its intended use. not because the fortress was weak, but because it was never besieged. Now for something important. In 1756 and again in 1813, all the gold and all the art of Dresden were brought to Königstein. The collection Green Vaults, the largest collection of Baroque jewelry in Europe. In 1813, once again the same place. In 1945, Raphael's Sistine Madonna was hidden right here in the casemates. Not in the woods, not in a monastery, not in a private house, in a fortress with 42-meter walls and the deepest well in the region. This is not military logic. This is storage logic. Now calculate. 6 years for a well. That's roughly 2,200 days. 152 meters in basalt rock. The manual drilling speed in solid rock, at best, is just a few dozen centimeters a day, with several teams working continuously. This operation is comparable in labor costs to a small mining enterprise. All for a well in a fortress that no one intended to besiege. If you think this is just standard construction, name one other fortress from that era where such resources were spent on water supply for a garrison that was never besieged in 400 years. It doesn't add up. Here's another detail that is easy to overlook. In 1725, within Königstein, the giant wine swamp was built. A reservoir with a volume of 238,600 liters. The largest wooden wine reservoir in Europe. In a military fortress. In case of a siege that never occurred. If you think the military commandant built giant wine barrels for his own enjoyment, imagine how many boards were needed for a 250,000-liter reservoir, how much it cost to transport them to the mountaintop, and how long it took. This is not entertainment. This is infrastructure for the prolonged autonomous existence of a large number of people. Königstein was not designed for a garrison of 200 people. It was meant to accommodate and sustain, for years if necessary, the entire government of Saxony, along with its retinue, archives, treasury, and provisions. This is not a fortress. This is a state in reserve mode. And here a second layer emerges. Königstein has housed over 1,000 prisoners throughout its history. These were not random individuals. Mikhail Bakunin, one of the leading revolutionary theorists in Europe. August Bebel, founder of the German social democracy. Johann Friedrich Butger, an alchemist whom Elector Augustus the Strong imprisoned here until he figured out how to produce Saxon porcelain. This is not a prison for criminals. It is a place of isolation for those whose knowledge or ideas were too dangerous for free circulation. Gold and documents were kept in the casemates. People with forbidden knowledge were kept in the cells above them. Just a difference in floors. The logic is the same. In the dungeons until 1919 lay 120 million gold marks of French military reparations. 120 million is not a strategic reserve. It is the entire financial fund of the state. Storing such an amount in a fortress, which, according to the official version, could not be taken by assault, makes sense. But building an impregnable military fortress solely to keep money and paintings in it, that's a different story. It is a safe, just a very large one, with cannons on the outside. Let's transport ourselves to Berlin. The year is 1594. On the island between the Havel and Spree rivers, the Spandau citadel is nearing completion. An ideal Italian-style bastion fort, 4 bastions, a perfect quadrilateral, fitted onto the island such that any approach to the walls requires crossing water. The architect is the Italian Francesco Chiaramella de Gandino, one of the best military engineers of his time. The walls of the Julius Tower are 3.5 meters thick. This is not a residential building. It is a structure designed to withstand direct hits from heavy artillery. And yet, in the year 1806, the citadel surrendered to Napoleon without a single shot being fired. The most obvious explanation is the military weakness of the garrison, the confusion of the command after the defeat near Jena. Let's assume that. But then, why did history repeat itself exactly in 1945? On May 1, 1945, the commander of the Spandau Citadel signed the capitulation before the Soviet forces started the artillery bombardment. The walls, 3.5 meters thick, could withstand shells. The commander knew that, and yet he still surrendered. Remember this date. Soviet troops entered the citadel of May 1st and found exactly what they had rushed for: the complete documentation of Schroeder's laboratories, formulas for the herd and sarin, work journals, samples of compounds. All of this was sent to Moscow and became the foundation of the Soviet chemical program for the following decades. The Julius Tower preserved not only the Prussian gold of the 19th century, it preserved the knowledge that reshaped the balance of the post-war world. The commandant surrendered in time. What was inside survived untouched, because beyond that lies the strange. In 1935, the Army Gas Defense Laboratory moved into the citadel. 300 scientists. It was here that in 1936, chemist Gerhard Schroeder accidentally synthesized tabun, the first nerve agent on an industrial scale. Then came sarin. In a 16th century architectural monument, in the center of Berlin, within walls that ensured secrecy as well as any classified facility in the open fields, because outside it was just an old fort. Historians usually explain this simply. The Nazis used available facilities. Practical. But then, why Spandau rather than any other building in Berlin? The casemates with 3.5-meter walls provide not only security for storage, they ensure isolation. What happens inside cannot be heard from the outside, neither in the literal sense nor in the figurative. Think of it differently. In 1936, Berlin was preparing for the Olympic Games, the city under the watchful eye of the whole world. Hundreds of foreign journalists, diplomats, athletes. And it is at this moment, in the city center, in an old 16th century fort, 300 scientists are synthesizing nerve paralytic substances. Not in a classified underground bunker, but in a facility that looks like a historical monument from the outside. Camouflage through history. To hide behind the facade of antiquity, because no one would think to look for a military laboratory inside a Renaissance castle. It was wise. It worked. And here's what doesn't add up. In the Julius Tower, the very same from the 13th century, the oldest building in Berlin, were stored 120 million gold marks of French reparations after the War of 1870. The same tower, the same logic. The valuable goes inside, the walls remain outside. The contents changed, the function did not. The Julius Tower has one technical detail that is often overlooked. Its walls, 3.5 meters thick, not only protect against artillery, they create a temperature and humidity buffer. Inside the tower, a stable microclimate is maintained year-round without any heating or ventilation. These are precisely the conditions under which documents, metals, and chemical compounds are preserved. The design is no coincidence. It is the result of precise calculation. The medieval architect built walls of such thickness not only against cannons, he built them against time. Look, Königstein is a vault for gold and art. Spandau is a vault for money, then for chemical formulas. In both cases, the fortress surrendered without a fight when the threat of destruction arose, as if the building itself was more important than the garrison, as if the order was to preserve the walls, not to hold the position. This is not a coincidence. This is behavior. Moreover, this behavior is institutional. It does not depend on who stands at the gates. In 1806, it was Napoleon. In 1945, the Soviet Army. Different enemies, different eras, different political systems. The same result: capitulation, the walls intact, the contents either preserved or evacuated in advance. It resembles a protocol, a pre-established order of actions that was handed down from commander to commander, regardless of the time. Now, Poland, Lower Silesia, the border of Lusatia and Silesia, the year 1910. German tobacco magnate Ernst Giocho purchases the ruins of the medieval Chok Castle overlooking Lake Lezhniansky. The purchase price is 1.5 million marks. The cost of reconstruction is another 3.5 million. In total, 5 million marks for an object that will officially be listed as a private romantic residence. To grasp the scale, with this amount of money in 1910, one could build a small military factory or an entire block of apartment buildings in Berlin. The architect of the reconstruction is Bodo Ebhardt. He is one of the leading specialists in medieval military fortification in Germany. Not a decorator, not an artist, a military architect who studied fortresses as engineering systems. And he built within this romantic residence 40 secret passages. 40. According to some reports, less than half have been discovered to this day. If you think that 40 secret corridors in a residential building are just a whim of a wealthy person, answer this simple question. Why would the wealthy want to hide from themselves where their corridors lead? One of the passages begins inside a cupboard in the library and leads to the owner's bedroom. This is the usual romance of castles. But 40 such passages. This is already infrastructure. This is a system, not a whim. And Eberhard, the man who designed military facilities, was building precisely systems. During World War II, the Abwehr, the military intelligence of Germany, had a cryptography school located in Chosh. The castle was perfectly suited for this purpose, a hard-to-access cliff above a lake. The only road controlled from a tower, and underground passages that allowed personnel to move around without going outside. In 1952, the Polish army classified the site. The castle was erased from the official maps of the country and used as a closed holiday home for high-ranking officers. Erased from the maps. A residential castle, an architectural monument, a tourist attraction, erased. Note what this means in practice. When an object is removed from official maps, it is not an administrative error. It is a targeted operation that requires the withdrawal of map additions, adjustments to registries, and briefing of the local population. It is expensive. It is labor-intensive. It is done only when the object represents a real operational interest. The Polish army in 1952 certainly knew why they needed a fortress with 40 secret passages already used by intelligence. And they preferred not to explain this to the population. This is not a careful attitude towards heritage. This is a regime of secrecy. Now pay attention to the chronology. Gutschov builds the castle with 40 secret passages in 1910. Ebhardt is a military architect. In 1940, the castle is handed over to the Abwehr. In 1952, the Polish army classifies it as secret. 3 different states, 3 different regimes, and all 3 deemed this object important enough to classify. This is a signature, not the whim of an architect, not a coincidence of war. This is an object with a stable, closed function that did not depend on who was in power. In the year 2015, personal belongings of Gutschov and documents indicating his connections with the Abwehr were found in the attic of the castle. Not hints, documents. A man who spent 5 million marks on building a castle with 40 secret passages had direct ties to the German military intelligence. Now the question is, when exactly was Choka's real function? Before the war or during it? Was the romantic residence originally designed as an intelligence hub disguised as an antique? This is a version, not a fact. But the architect is military. There are 40 corridors. The owner is tied to intelligence. The castle has been classified since the war. Each of these facts can be explained separately. Together, it becomes more complicated. There is one more detail that is difficult to explain through the logic of a romantic residence. In the cellars of Choki, at the beginning of the 20th century, a cooling unit known as autofrigor was installed, an industrial refrigeration system. In a residential castle of the early 20th century, refrigeration technology of that time was an expensive piece of equipment, typically installed in food enterprises or medical facilities. The only reason it would be placed in a private castle would be if there were items stored there that required a consistently low temperature. What exactly? There are no documents. But the list of candidates is alarming in itself. Photographic materials that deteriorate with heat, biological samples, chemical compounds with low storage temperatures, photographic plates with classified documents. None of these options fits the picture of a summer residence of a tobacco magnate. Each of them fits the picture of an operational storage facility for an intelligence node. And the last of the 4, Austria, northern Burgenland, the border of the territory that was under the control of the Ottoman Empire for 400 years. The fortress of Fortenstein, 511 meters above sea level, a dolomitic outcrop, the Black Tower, standing 50 meters tall, a moat carved directly into the rock, and not a single storming in its entire history. The Ottomans, who captured Belgrade, besieged Vienna twice, and held half of Hungary under control, never approached Fortenstein. Official explanation: the cost of the siege outweighed the benefits. A standard argument for castles that are too strong, but here it doesn't work so simply, because in 1692, inside the castle, the treasury of the Esterházy family, a wealthy aristocratic house in Europe, was established. Okay, let's assume that the walls really did repel the Ottomans. Then answer another question. Why was the fortress, for protection against the Turks, built and maintained in perfect condition for another 100 years after the Turkish threat in this region completely disappeared after 1683? The walls were reinforced, collections were expanded, and the castle grew larger. There was no threat, yet the site continued to function in maximum protection mode. This means that protection from the Turks was never the actual function. The Turks were merely a convenient justification. Access to the treasury is through a secret passage. The lock has 2 keys. One is with the prince, the other with the treasurer. It cannot be opened without both. During the Second World War, the treasure vault was neither found nor opened. The most obvious explanation is that the Germans did not seek it out. But that's not the case. The Nazis systematically confiscated the valuables of the Austrian aristocracy after the Anschluss in 1938. Many collections were confiscated, transported, and documented, but not the collection of Forchtenstein. What strikes one about this detail is that we're not talking about a small provincial castle that was lost. Forchtenstein is the main residence of the Esterházy family, one of the most famous aristocratic houses of Austria-Hungary. Their estates, collections, and assets were well known to the Nazi officials responsible for confiscations. Well known, and yet untouched. This is no longer a matter of not found. This is not touched. The reason for this remains unknown. Why? Now for something interesting. The castle's documents record that exotic artifacts were stored in its corridors, such as a stuffed giant crocodile, the bones of giants, and objects of clearly non-standard origin. This is not just an intriguing detail. The owners deliberately cultivated an atmosphere of unpredictability around the castle. It is the year 1700, but the mechanism is the same as that used in psychological perimeter defense today, to create in potential adversaries a sense that the object contains something best left alone. To call it the superstition of the era is too simplistic. It was a tool, and it worked. There is one more detail that doesn't fit the picture of a merely wealthy castle. The Forchtenstein well is carved directly into the dolomite rock, without facing, without brickwork, pure stone. This required not just construction skills, it demanded special mining tools and experience working with a specific type of rock. Where did specialists in dolomite mining come from in a 15th century Austrian aristocratic estate? Either they were brought in specifically, which in itself implies serious planning, or those who built the castle originally knew that this site needed to be self-sufficient for a very long time. In the inventories of the 17th century, among the contents of the treasury, a unicorn horn is mentioned. This is not a fairy tale. It is a Narva tusk, which at the time was valued more than gold of equal weight, and was used as a universal antidote. The treasury housed silver furniture, an Ottoman tent from the year 1624, and a collection of weapons. This is not merely wealth. It is the material history of several centuries of European politics, captured in objects. And all of this has survived. It has remained in its original place. The only Baroque collection in Europe that has not moved since its creation. But there is one detail in this survival that is difficult to explain by mere luck. The double lock system, one key with the prince, the other with the treasurer, was documented in the 17th century. It existed in an era when most fortresses were taken from within through bribing servants. Creating a system in which one person physically cannot open the vault is not paranoia. It is an understanding of a specific threat. Someone in the 17th century knew exactly where the real danger would come from, not from the outside, but from within, and designed a defense specifically against it. The second key still exists. Its location is unknown. Look at the four objects together. Königstein, a safe for the state treasures of Saxony. No battles fought. It surrenders diplomatically at the first threat of a real assault. Spandau, a safe for Prussian gold, later for formulas for chemical weapons. It surrenders without resistance in 1806 and in 45. Chocha, a military intelligence site disguised as a private castle, classified after the war. 40 hidden passages. Hochstein, a private treasury protected by a psychological barrier and a double lock. Not found, not opened. Now compare this to what was happening around. In 1813, French troops, during their retreat, destroyed dozens of Saxon fortresses and castles. Not Königstein. In 1945, Soviet forces, during the Berlin operation, destroyed a significant portion of the city's historic buildings. Not Spandau. Polish castles in Silesia suffered massively in 1945, from shelling, looting, and fires. Not China. Austrian aristocratic collections were systematically catalogued and seized by Nazi officials after the Anschluss. Not Fortechenstein. In each case, something bypassed the object. Not the strength of the walls. Not the randomness of the route. Something else. None of them were destroyed in the wars that flattened dozens of other fortresses in the same regions. What unites them is not the thickness of the walls. The walls of the destroyed fortresses were just as thick. What binds them is their content. When the army approached Königstein, gold and paintings lay in the casemates. When the Soviet troops surrounded Spandau, documents from the laboratories were in the Julius Tower. When Poland classified Chochu, there was something inside that could not be made available to the public. When the Nazis documented Austrian collections, Fürstenstein remained off the lists. Every time, a surrender without a fight. Every time, the contents are preserved. Every time, the military fortress acted like a person who values handing over their wallet more than risking their life. This is the behavior of a guard, not a soldier. And here's what is striking about this picture. The objects survived not only because of those who owned them. They survived because the opposing side, the victor, the occupier, the enemy, also chose not to destroy them. The Soviet troops preserved Spandau and transported the contents of the laboratories. American forces documented the treasures of Königstein in 1945, but left the walls untouched. The Polish army did not demolish Chocha. It classified it and utilized it. This is not a random magnanimity of the victors. Soviet troops in 1945 destroyed an immense amount of German historical heritage, deliberately and methodically. They preserved Spandau because there was something to gain from it. The Americans documented the contents of Königstein not out of love for Saxon culture. They were inventorying trophies. The Polish army classified Chocha because the 40 secret passages in the Abwehr infrastructure represented operational value. The enemies spared no objects. They appropriated their function. The enemies fought against each other, but all of them chose to preserve these walls. This is no longer just luck. And it changes the entire question. Not how did they survive, but why did both sides of every war want them to survive? So the real question is not why did they survive? It is another question. Why did both sides of every war want them to survive? This is no longer a story of defense. It is a story of a function that was equally important for both those who defended and those who attacked. Take another look at Königstein. In 1945, Soviet soldiers found Raphael's Sistine Madonna in the dungeons of this fortress. It had been there all along, packed in wooden crates, in the dark, within a stable microclimate of stone walls. The director of the Dresden Art Gallery, who ordered the relocation of the collection, didn't simply choose a secure place. He relied on 200 years of statistics. Saved in 1756. Saved in 1813. This was not hope. It was a precedent. This is a version, not a fact. But look at the result. 4 fortresses, 4 wars, each of which could have destroyed them. 4 surrenders, each of which preserved the object. The same outcome for 400 years. Armies did not storm these objects, possibly because both sides of each conflict understood what was stored there, and both were interested in its preservation. There are no documents about this, or they too are kept within the walls that no one has stormed. There is also the final observation, which seems insignificant until you piece everything together. All 4 objects are still classified to some extent. Not completely, but part of the documents regarding Spandau remain classified to this day. Some of the underground passages of Chochy are officially undiscovered, which means they are either genuinely not found or access to them is restricted. The inventories of Forchtenstein have never been published in full. The cellars of Königstein are closed to tourists in certain sections without any explanation. 4 objects, 4 partial declassifications, decades after their military function ended. This is an important detail. Typically, secrecy is lifted when the threat passes. Declassified CIA documents, opened KGB archives, publications of former military sites. Here, there is none of that. Secrecy is actively maintained. Compare. Documents on the activities of the CIA in Latin America in the 1970s were declassified after 25 years. Soviet nuclear programs became available to researchers in the 1990s. Yet the documents of the Spandau chemical laboratories from 1945 are still closed. What exactly in these documents requires protection 80 years after the end of the war? The formulas for sarin are known. Schrader has been identified. The history of the laboratory has been published. But something in the Spandau archives remains closed. This indicates not inertia of bureaucracy. It means that someone today is making a conscious decision that the release of certain information is undesirable. Gold, art, chemical formulas. This is what has become known. Königstein returned the Sistine Madonna. Spandau provided the Soviet Union with Schrader's documentation. Chocka trained the codebreakers. Forchtenstein preserved the collection that even the Nazis left untouched. This is no longer a null. This is the inventory of the visible part. But this is just the visible part. The part that was managed to be recorded before it was transported, classified, or sealed off. In the undiscovered passages of Chocka, in the closed basements of Königstein, in the unpublished inventories of Forchtenstein, there lies another part. Nothing is known about it. Not because there's nothing there, but because no one is allowed in. And here lies the real question. This distinction between is silent and does not know defines everything. If one does not know, it indicates gaps in research. If one is silent, it is a decision being made right now by someone who has access to these walls and who believes that we do not need to know this. 400 years ago, someone decided that these objects were more important than armies. Armies changed. Regimes changed. Wars came to an end. The objects remained. And a part of what is stored within them is still closed off. This is the only fact that does not require an explanation.